Hi, everybody. Today is Friday, December 13th, and Professor Marandi is back with us. Welcome back, Professor.
Thank you very much for inviting me again, Nima.
Let's get started with what's going on right now in Syria, Professor. Do you think that the situation is getting out of the hand? Because right now, it doesn't seem they're killing people. They're just, Israelis are attacking Syria, and Americans and Turkey are fighting each other and on in some regions considering Kurds. And what is your take on what is happening right now in Syria?
Well, personally, although I think this is a setback for the resistance, a significant setback, but I don't think in the long term it's the resistance that's hurt. In the long term, I think it's actually the opponents of the resistance that are hurt the most as a result of what happens in Syria. First of all, the war on terror apparently has come to an end because all of this started, all of the wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, and the mess that they've created, and the Patriot Act, and all the new laws that were passed across Europe that limited freedom and allowed the government to spy on citizens. All of these are unnecessary today because Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda is now in the Western camp. The leaders of Al-Qaeda, because remember, HTS, when it split away from Al-Qaeda, it did not split away because of ideological differences. It was it was consensual. The two sides agreed. They actually, I tweeted this today as a reminder. The actual ceremony where Jolani declared his separation. He thanked Al-Qaeda, and he praised Osama bin Laden in that speech. And I refer your audience to that tweet just a few hours ago. It was basically for PR. It was basically to get into the good books of NATO, the West, the United States. And during these 8 years, that's basically what they've done. We saw CNN, for example, which is very close to the deep state in the United States, do a number of interviews and reports from Idlib over the years to improve the image of Jabhat al-Nusra or Hayat Tahrir Sham, or Al-Qaeda, as I would call it more, which makes it more simple. So now that Al-Qaeda and the people of Al-Qaeda are moderates, then the Patriot Act should be thrown out the window and the war of terror should be declared over. But sadly, that's not the case. The United States will continue to wage war and terror across the region because of this group, and the laws will not go back to normal. Surveillance in the West will be far greater than any surveillance we have here in Iran. Of course, if the government in Iran had the capabilities that they do in the West, perhaps they do the same. But the point is that they have the amount of surveillance that they have in the West is much greater. But I believe that this is not going to go well. This is going to be an immense burden on the people of Turkey. Cultural. They're going to have cultural consequences. They're going to have massive financial consequences. Qatar will definitely help Al-Qaeda in Syria as much as it can, and the other terror groups. But the burden of a country is very different than the burden of small Idlib somewhere in the north of Syria. So this is going to create difficulty, major difficulty. Also, I think it's going to complicate Turkey's relations with countries across Asia. The Chinese have taken note of what's going on, and they see the footage of their nationals fighting in Syria, having been trained by terrorists under the authority of the Turkish state. And the same is true with Uzbekistan and other countries. And of course, Russia is unhappy, and the Iranians obviously are not happy at all either. So that's one issue. Another issue is that countries in the region that are in the American camp are worried. Saudi Arabia is worried. The Emirates is worried. Jordan is very worried. So these countries which have not done anything, like Turkey hasn't done anything for the Palestinians. They continue to sell oil or Baku oil, cheap Baku oil to Netanyahu, and they have trade and business and political ties. But the same is true across the region. Saudi Arabia, of course, doesn't have those ties with the Israeli regime, but still, none of these countries have been seen as helping the Palestinian cause, and many of them have like Saudi Arabia, have moved towards secularism, you know, concerts with half-naked women dancing and singing and that sort of thing. And now the Salafists, the Wahhabis, are seeing that their brothers in Syria have achieved a major score, a major victory. So that, I think, will have a significant impact in countries like Saudi Arabia and Jordan and elsewhere. So it's not clear what the consequences of all this will be. In addition, I do not see Al-Qaeda or HCS as capable of governing the country. Not just because of the financial issues, but also because of the deep divide between the different factions. And some of these factions make Jolani look very moderate indeed, even though he's an extremist, and his current present, the way in which he presents himself is very different from who he actually is in his history. But some of the groups that he has to deal with are far more extreme than himself. And even people within his own group, they will not submit to just anything that he says. We've seen this since 2012, 13. We've seen how people from different factions left one faction to join another. During the dirty war in Syria, there were many different factions, and sometimes people would leave one and join another, sometimes in large groups. So this is going to be a very, very tough situation. And I also believe that there's a possibility that countries like Saudi Arabia may start funding groups like Jaish al-Islam has in the past always been closely associated with Saudi Arabia. Iraqi Kurdish groups will be funding Kurdish groups in Syria, and the list goes on. So I think that there's a lot of trouble ahead. And remember when in Libya they overthrew the Libyan government, years later everyone was speaking about the good old days when Muammar Gaddafi was ruling over the country. So we'll have to wait and see. This is not a revolution where millions came to the street and there was a general consensus. This is not a military coup where a part of the political establishment comes to power. These are extremist groups that I recall over the many years that I've been to Syria. I've been to Syria both before and after the dirty war began. But after the dirty war began, I've been there many times. Actually, the last time I went was just a few weeks ago when I passed through Syria from Lebanon coming back to Iran during the war in Lebanon. But when in 2013, 14, 15, 16, I would lecture at universities to an English audience or audiences. And I'd speak to students in private and small groups, especially at the University of Damascus, more than anywhere else. And it was clear that some liked the president, some disliked him, some were somewhere in the middle, but no one wanted these extremist groups that were being supported by Mr. Erdogan. And I find it very difficult to imagine that these groups will be able to manage to keep or gain popular support in Syria in the coming months.
Many people are asking, they're still so confused about the situation in Syria and how the government was not able to fight against these Takfiris. And they handed it over to these people without any sort of fight. How, right now, how can you explain what has happened to Syria in those days?
Well, Syria emptied out. The United States imposed, and its allies imposed cruel sanctions against ordinary Syrians. The objective was to bring the Syrian people to their knees. And that just shows the nature of Western governments, that they are willing to destroy people to get what they want. They're just as criminal as Netanyahu. So they brought the Syrian people to their knees economically. And then meanwhile, while they're starving people in Syria, they were stealing their oil and grains from northeastern Syria. And the Americans were exporting it, making money off of it. And the grains were being exported as well and also being used by their own people. So the people of Syria were deprived from their own resources. Their resources were being stolen while they were starving. Then you had Turkey, of course, constantly carrying out terror attacks across northern Syria through these terrorist organizations, and the army had to constantly be based around Idlib over the past few years. But even before that, the dirty war took a lot of energy. And then, of course, the Americans occupied the south east of the country alongside the northeast, and the Israelis constantly bomb Syria, both by using Jordanian airspace, also from the Mediterranean or Lebanon or from the Golan. So the Syrians have, been suffering a great deal. And of course, the government, the state is a state that had lots of corruption, but also extremely impoverished. And when you have poverty because of the sanctions and because of the dirty war, that increases corruption. So the ruling party had a lot of corruption. I don't want to say everyone was corrupt, but there was a lot of corruption. And then with the sanctions, it just got worse and worse. So it reminds me of, in a way, Nicaragua, when the Sandinistas were in power. The United States used the Contra rebels to weaken the Sandinistas. From Honduras, and ultimately they created such misery that people voted the Sandinistas out. But then the pro-American government that came in was so horrible that people, at their first opportunity, went back to the Sandinistas, and they're still in power. But my concern is that the Americans are going to use the tool of sanctions to bring down Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua, because now now that they have succeeded in Syria, then things I was in Cuba a while back, and the situation there was very difficult, very difficult. And so that's how the Americans work. They crush people, they kill people, they destroy civil society in order to get their way. And but this is not strange anymore, because over the last 14 months, people have been seeing the ongoing Holocaust.
How is it going to influence the relationship between Iran and Turkey right now?
Well, it's very strange, because one of the things that has changed a lot is that Iran has become much more popular in the eyes of people across the global south. A lot of people are very upset with what Erdogan did. Of course, there's a significant part of the Turkish population and Arab population that has been driven by sectarianism or ethnicity, I'm very surprised at how different it is today than a decade ago or even a couple of years ago. I've noticed that a lot of people online have been criticizing Iran for trying to expand economic ties with Turkey. Erdogan is not Turkey. For Iran, Turkey is Turkey. Erdogan is a person. Erdogan, in my opinion, is a tragedy. He's destroying Turkey or Turkey, and he's like Netanyahu. His uh, uh, it's basically he's doing it for himself. He wants to be the, I don't know, maybe he wants to he feels that maybe he's in the shadow of Ataturk yet, and he wants to make a permanent name for himself as the person who expanded Turkish borders and that sort of thing, which is not something to be proud of, but something that he wants to do. But he is not. So he's doing it for himself, even though I think the Turkish people are going to pay the price. Just like Netanyahu does things for himself, and I don't believe that Israel won the war. I mean, I agree that because of the betrayal of Erdogan, that we can no longer say that Israel was defeated. I would say that Israel was defeated until up to the ceasefire, up to when the collapse of Syria began. But I can't say that now. I don't think we can say that. However, the delegitimization of Zionism and the Zionist regime in the eyes of the world is extraordinarily important. And I think this is a major defeat for the Israeli regime. The Israeli regime can never again use anti-Semitism or the Holocaust to justify its Holocaust, its own Holocaust, to justify its atrocities. That is finished, and it is despised across the world and especially across the region, and that is. And hundreds of billions of dollars can't rectify that. Trillions of dollars cannot fix that. When the world sees you as a bunch of racist murderers, that's as bad as it can get. So in the Netanyahu, though, he doesn't care about the image of Israel. He wants ordinary Israelis to look at him as their hero. So the land grab in Syria or the slaughter of Lebanese and the Holocaust in Gaza, that makes most people in Israel happy. So that's what he's looking at. So he's doing it for himself. So I consider him and Erdogan to be quite similar in that respect. But Turkey is not Erdogan. And even during the dirty war in Syria in 2012, 13, 14, Iran and Turkey continue to cooperate economically, and they will continue to do so in future. But I think that Turkey, unfortunately, will be paying a price, and it's especially sad because Turkey is a country with a strong Sufist culture. Sufism in Turkey is very strong. That's what makes the culture in Turkey and Iran so similar. But I think since the dirty war in Syria, there has been change. It's a change that I've noticed when I've gone to Turkey, and even when I would go out, let's say just recently during the anniversary of October the 7th, I was invited there for a conference. Even when I went out, some of my Turkish friends were saying, be careful about where you go and that sort of thing. That's not something that used to be the case, 10, 15 years ago.
And right now in the United States and in Israel, many people are arguing that the resistance was defeated and the link between Iran and Hezbollah is not anymore there, and to help Hezbollah fighting Israelis. What would be your response to those people who are arguing this, and how is it going to influence the link between Iran and Hezbollah?
Hezbollah's military infrastructure is very much intact, and the Americans are talking nonsense about destroying it. Overwhelmingly, their assets are underground, and for the most part, they haven't even been touched. The Israelis never even went deep inside Lebanon. They didn't even reach the the areas where Hezbollah has its most capabilities. If they did, they would have been facing ambush after ambush, and they would have been devastated. So Hezbollah's strength is very much intact, and Iran has no difficulty uh, getting what is needed in Lebanon into Lebanon. That's not going to. I mean, Yemen was supported by uh, Iran during the genocidal war that the Saudis and the Emiratis were carrying out. And the American Navy was off the coast of, it was in the Red Sea, imposing a starvation siege. But even then, Iran was able to get what was necessary into Yemen, and we saw how ultimately the Saudis had to accept a ceasefire. And Gaza's capable. What has allowed Gaza to hold out for the last 14 months is the military capabilities that the Iranians gave to them. The underground infrastructure, the weapons. How did they get there? They didn't go through Syria, and they certainly didn't go through Palestine. So there are ways to do these things, and the Iranians have been doing it for a very long time. So I don't see Hezbollah's. I actually think that Hezbollah's stature has risen across the world immensely. The sacrifices that they made for Palestine willingly is extraordinary. Ansarullah and Hezbollah, their stature is gone through the roof. And while people while over the past couple of weeks, there's been a lot of sectarianism and a lot of racial comments online that we've been seeing, and obviously we should all ignore these voices. But I think that's not going to change anything. The world is very different from 2011, 12, 13. A lot of people see through the dirty war. A lot of people see what's going on. Back then, in 2011, 12, 13, there were just a handful of people that were trying to create awareness about the dirty war in Syria, and that's changed. I mean, there are voices on the internet. I don't want to name any of them because I'll miss quite a few names, and I'll be, it's not right. But people are much more awake today, and I personally, although I have noticed that many of our friends have become a bit. They're down or a bit depressed, but I think that's something that they should put aside. We don't have the luxury to feel depressed or to feel disappointed. There's a lot of work to do. I would encourage your viewers to go and read the speech that Ayatollah Khamenei made yesterday. I think it has been fully translated into English and of course Arabic, and I think that is a very interesting speech that he made. It was roughly 50 minutes, so the translation probably would take a few minutes to read, but I think it's worth doing so, and it'll give some insight about Iranian thinking with regards to the current situation.
And one of the main issues that he has mentioned in this speech, he said that the Syrian army was not willing to fight. That's why we cannot fight for them. We can help them, but we cannot fight for them. And do you think what has happened in Syria was because of the government, the leadership in Syria was thinking that they can be closer to the Arab states, to the United States, or the situation was worse than that?
Before I respond, I should also point out that he said that we had prepared troops and equipment to send to Syria, but the Americans and the Israelis blocked the way. And they forced our planes to turn back, and they wouldn't let us use the ground routes to go to Syria. So this shows that Erdogan, Netanyahu, and Biden the three of them were in this together. Of course, with one of the countries in the Persian Gulf region, Qatar. but these three countries were in it together. So he said they blocked he said only one plane went through, and the plane was threatened by the Israelis. They threatened to shoot down the plane, but the pilot ignored it. He gave this. He said this specifically. He said, "Well, brave pilot ignored the threats and went to Syria." But the other planes were forced to go back, and the ground route was blocked, and the Americans, effectively, the Americans and the Israelis would have attacked the forces that would come in from Iraq. So this shows that this was a joint operation carried out by Netanyahu, Erdogan, and the Americans. But getting back to what you asked, yes, this goes back to what I was saying earlier, and that is that Syria was hollowed out. It's become very poor. In 2011, Syria was doing pretty well. Of course, because of some of the liberal policies that were being pursued by the Syrian government, some of the poorer areas were becoming increasingly poor. And also the Syrian government had allowed the Saudis to build these Salafist schools and Wahhabi schools, and so that combination was those liberal policies and the extremism. Of course, the Saudi policy back then is very different from Saudi policy today, because Mohammed bin Salman pursues a very different route, which is, as I said, also dangerous for him under these circumstances. But in any case, so Syria is emptied out. A general makes $40 a month, and these terrorists, some of them made up to $2,000 a month. So when the country is broken and impoverished, the will to fight is no longer there. People are just struggling to survive. And the Iranians cannot fight on behalf of Syria. Or the Russians, they cannot fight on behalf of Syria. They can fight alongside Syria. They can help them. And remember, in 2013, that's exactly what happened. Iran did not enter Syria in 2011 or 12 when it began. It began in 2011. Iran and Hezbollah entered in 2013. Why? Because by then, Erdogan had brought in tens of thousands of foreign fighters. People should go and read about Serena Shim. She was a journalist on the border between Turkey and Syria, and she reported that World Food Organization trucks were being used to take in weapons and troops for ISIS into Syria. And then Turkish intelligence, they said that she's carrying out espionage. She went on television, live TV, and said, they said I'm a spy, and I'm very worried I'm not a spy. And then hours later, she was killed in a truck hit her car and killed her. That wasn't an accident. So, the reality was that Turkey, or Mr. Erdogan and his people, they were supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the other groups that were wrecking Syria. But back then, Iran did not enter until these tens of thousands of foreign fighters had come in. So when there were tens of thousands of foreign fighters that had been brought in from across the world, then Iran entered. And a friend of mine who was in Pakistan during the 1980s and involved in the whole Mujahideen issue, he told me in late 2011 in Lebanon, where I was living at that time, he told me that this is a dirty war. And he said, all the people who I knew in Pakistan who were involved in Afghanistan are now in Istanbul. All the people that he knew back then were. So in 2013, the Iranians came in when the foreign fighters when there were tens of thousands of foreign fighters from across the world. But Iran even then was supporting the Syrians. They trained troops, they had advisors in the different military, among the troops, but they were fighting alongside them. But they lost the will to fight. and the country is broken. And for me, the question is, how is Al-Qaeda, with these fanatics that they have, how are they going to improve the healthcare system? How are they going to improve education? How are they going to improve higher education? How are they going to uh, rebuild industry? Uh, I think this is going to I think it's not going to end well.
And the situation right now in it with Syria is going to, it seems that in the mind of Israelis, they're thinking that, in fact, today and yesterday, they were talking about attacking Iranian nuclear facilities, because right now with the situation in Syria, we know that they have destroyed everything in Syria, all the military equipments, all the bases. And right now it seems that they're feeling it's much easier to attack Iran. What was, if you were going to mention the role of Syria in the latest attack, Israeli attack on Iran, what did they do in order to avoid that? Which right now it seems so huge in the mind of Israelis that right now it's getting easier to attack Iran.
Well, first of all, Iran is going to strike the Israeli regime. I have no doubt about that. And this has, some people say, well, why, if you had done it earlier, I mean, I'm not in charge, but if Iran had done it earlier, this would have happened or that wouldn't have happened, which is not true. If the Israelis were going to strike Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, it would have no relationship to, or it would not, it's not linked to an Iranian strike on Israel. They would still do it. If Erdogan and Netanyahu want to undermine Syria, an Iranian strike on Israel is not going to change anything. Of course, Iran's strike will definitely happen, and it will weaken the Israeli regime, and it's not far off. Have no doubt about that. And all those people who get angry with me, they will see that ultimately it happens, and the Israeli regime will be hurt. But no, the fall of Syria has no impact on the ability for the Israeli regime to strike Iran, or it's not going to change things, because last time round the Israelis flew over Syrian airspace, and the Syrians were not engaging with the Israelis, especially in the east of Syria. Their defenses are almost non-existent. So it's not going to have an impact. This is psychological warfare. The problem for Israel is, there are two problems. One is that if there's a back and forth with Iran, the Israelis will be hit much harder than Iran, because the Iranians have a strong offensive capability. And it will happen, as I said, Iran will strike Israel. That's inevitable. You just have to wait, and it will happen, just like last time. It will be much more devastating than last time. But so the Israelis will not win in any in exchange with Iran. Their only hope is to have the Americans come in. But if the Americans get involved, then Iran, as we all know, Iran is going to strike back at American bases, but also those regimes that host those American bases. That will be the end of Qatar. Qatar will be finished. There will be no gas, no oil. And you can say the same about those other tiny regimes that have all these oil and gas assets. Is that something that the Americans want? Because it would drive global energy prices through the roof. And so if someone told me that, well, the United States is independent, it produces its own energy, that's nonsense. If the price of a gallon of gasoline goes through the roof, if it goes to $15, $20 a gallon, the consumer is still going to pay that money, whether it's American oil and American gasoline, or it's foreign oil and foreign gasoline. The oil producers may be making a lot of money, but the American people and the Europeans, of course, they don't even have oil. They will suffer the consequences. They will bring down the global economy, and it will bring down the American economy. So there is a balance of terror between Iran and the United States. And thus, I think there are a lot of people in Washington who are sane enough to understand the implications that this would have for the United States. But no, it won't impact the ability of Israel to strike Iran. Syria did not impede the Israeli regime before, and it won't impede it now. What impedes the Israeli regime is Iran's capabilities, which I think people will learn more about shortly.
We have seen the behavior of Turkey so far in Syria. How about the yeah? How about the threat?
I would say Erdogan. Erdogan.
Erdogan,
I
yeah,
wouldn't say Turkey.
that's
Yeah.
right, Erdogan. In
Turkey, I don't believe this is the will of Turkey.
yeah, and when you look at the behavior of Erdogan so far and the way that it seems that Iranians are concerned about the situation expanding to Iraq, because they've said that if something wrongs happen in at the border with Iraq, they're going to be on the ground fighting these people, these Takfiris. Do you think that Erdogan would support that, or he has some sort of limitations?
Well, he has ambitions for both northern Syria and northern Iraq, which I think are not achievable because Turkey has a lot of internal problems and it has a huge Kurdish population that's unhappy, or at least a large segment of them are unhappy. He has a very difficult economy. He's very vulnerable. Remember when last time he had a fight with Trump, Trump threatened sanctions, and Erdogan immediately capitulated, and he handed over that pastor who was in prison. So Erdogan, he is very vulnerable. There isn't much that there isn't a great deal that he can do without causing a lot of trouble at home. And if Erdogan pushes Al Qaeda or facilitates Al Qaeda's um, movement towards Iraq, like he did with ISIS. That's what he did when ISIS entered Iraq. That will push Iraq closer to Iran. So right now, Iraq is moving closer to Iran because Iraq feels threatened. But also another difference between now and 2000 and 2000 and the previous decade in general is that Iraq is a much stronger country. It has the popular mobilization forces, and they will only empower the popular mobilization forces further and the Iraqi military by threatening Iraq, and these are Iran's allies. So this is not 2012 and 2013 or 2014. Iraq is a much stronger country today than it was back then. And Al-Qaeda and Daesh are not as strong as they were back then. The number of people who took over Syria are not large. They were much smaller than the Syrian army. The Syrian army just melted away. And I think probably the Americans and the Israelis and Erdogan's people, they bought off a lot of these people. Remember, during the riots in Iran 2-3 years ago, a large number of people who were arrested, they had been contacted by foreign intelligence agencies or organizations abroad, and they would be asked to carry out some attacks on buildings or set fire to somewhere, and then take footage and send it to them, and then they would be paid through Bitcoin. And let's say that the Israeli regimes, the Israelis have arrested a number of people allegedly for because they were spying for Iran. I would imagine that's the Iranians have been doing the same thing. And I would also imagine, this is all just speculation. I have absolutely no inside information about any of these things, but about the spies inside Israel. But I would imagine, I would guess that a lot of people in the Syrian army or senior people, they were made offers at the appropriate time. But in any case, now it's not like back then. Al-Qaeda and Daesh are much weaker, and Iraq is significantly stronger. Hezbollah is much stronger today than it was back then. And Iran is much stronger. And I think that people are much more aware about what's going on today. It's, as I said, than mainstream media, the mainstream Western media, or Arabic media owned by these regional despots. They don't have the influence that they did before. And the euphoria that we see now among some people, I think it's going to gradually die down when the situation in Syria does not improve and probably gets worse.
Donald Trump had an interview with the Time magazine in which he was asked about if he trusts Netanyahu. He said that I don't trust anybody. And on the other hand, the second question was important. He was asked if he's going to attack Iran. He said anything can happen. It's a very volatile situation. And about the people in the West Bank, for the case of annexation of the West Bank, he said he didn't answer the question and he talked about two-state solution. And there are many ways to go after that plan. Right now, do you think when you evaluate the way that he's talking about the situation in the Middle East in this interview, these three important points, do you think that he wants some sort of ceasefire, some sort of calmness in that region, or he's going to be convinced to go to war?
A couple of things that I should add, by the way, before I answer again, sorry. One is the situation for Qatar. Qatar is funding Al-Qaeda and these other groups in Idlib. In fact, Qatar funds a lot of things that Turkey does. I mean, uh, I know this for a fact that a lot of TRT's funding comes from Qatar. I know this for reasons that I can't explain here. And I haven't learned that from Iran. I've learned that from people outside of Iran. But Qatar, when it was blockaded by Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, they were practically on their knees. And their only hope was Iran. And Iran at that time had poor relations, had no relations with Saudi Arabia. And Iran, despite all that Qatar had done in Syria and Iraq, the Iranians helped them, and they didn't impose anything on Qatar. Iran could have imposed, all sorts of conditions, financial and otherwise, but they didn't. The circumstances in the region have changed, and Iran now has relations with Saudi Arabia. So I think Qatar should be much more careful about how it deals with minorities and others. One of the most influential Qatari Al Jazeera talk show hosts yesterday tweeted that he was tweeting for mass beheadings in Syria. And and I think that it says a lot about Al Jazeera Arabic, at least, but it says a great deal about Al Jazeera Arabic. But it's not good for Qatar. Of course, later he had to withdraw his tweet, but the sentiments are obviously there. So Qatar is not exactly it's not where it was before, and it should be very careful about its behavior. And if, by the way, there is a strike by the Americans on Iran, because that's what you're alluding to, well, the American air base is in Qatar, and therefore Iran would retaliate, of course, and strike the base, but Iran will also see Qatar as an aggressor. And therefore, you should expect the complete destruction of Qatar's oil and gas infrastructure, which would mean the end of Qatar as we know it. So there is a balance of terror between Iran and the United States. And these little family regimes should be very careful about their own future. And they should be hoping that sanity prevails in Washington.
And how about Donald Trump and his point of view about the war?
Regardless of what happened in Syria, the balance of power has shifted. This is not the United States that he ran, and this is not the world that he was dealing with. China, Russia, Iran, and others are growing more powerful. Even India, have no doubt, has concerns about what's going on in Syria. But Donald Trump, by the way, when I mean, let me put it this way. Donald Trump himself spoke about Obama's relationship with ISIS. Donald Trump, when he came to power, he didn't help defeat ISIS. The General Soleimani and Hezbollah and the Russians and the Syrian army and the Iraqis and the Afghan volunteers, they were defeating them. But ultimately, when they were winning the war and the United States saw that Syria was taking back its territory, it joined the fight. It was not for moral considerations. The United States wanted a land grab in the northeastern Syria, part of Syria. But the point is that he chose to fight against ISIS for whatever reason, rather than fighting the Syrian army. So I think he understands. I mean, so the question, the question for me is, regardless of why he did it, his intentions, the argument that Iran has always had and put forward, and I'm sure the same is true with Russia and Hezbollah, is that the choice in Syria was between a government that was deeply flawed and ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And we would never choose ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Well, the choice that the Americans made under Trump was definitely, for whatever reason, was not Al-Qaeda, or ISIS at least. So I think that's something that when these Western, when Trumpers or supporters of Trump speak about Syria, they have to, or they have to answer that question, that he chose to fight the same people for whatever reason that the Syrian army was fighting. But in addition to that, I would say the same about Mr. Erdogan, because some of his supporters are saying that, he defeated this evil monster in Damascus. Well, first of all, if it wasn't for the dirty war that he engaged in, we wouldn't have had all those hundreds of thousands of people die. But beyond that, and Syria, if it being a dictatorship, wouldn't make it any worse than all the other dictatorships that are allied to the West in the region. All of the, you have, the region is full of pro-Western dictatorships. The only difference is that in Syria, it said no to Israel. It said it refused to submit to Israel. So that was the difference, and that's why it was so terrible. But if Mr. Erdogan overthrew the Syrian government for moral reasons and replaced it with Al-Qaeda, then why was he trying to establish ties with Assad over the last couple of years? Why was he trying to befriend him again? Why was he trying to normalize? If Assad is the bad guy and he's a monster that has to be removed, then why was he trying to improve relations with the monster? These inconsistencies in the West and with Mr. Erdogan and his supporters, I think, are clear as day. So whenever they say, Iran chose Assad, well, so did the United States. Or when Mr. Erdogan saw that his the undermining of Syria in the past had reached a dead end, he did the same. He tried to move towards Syria. So these arguments that are being used against Iran are not. They're not, at least at the moral level, they're not valid. Iran fought these extremists because it believed that they are much worse than what existed in of the nature of the Syrian government that existed until recently, and that continues to be the case.
The main,
but just sorry, I should add that Donald Trump, as I was saying, he is in a different world today. Iran is much stronger. The United States has many more difficulties. And if he chooses conflict, that would destroy the U.S. economy. That would destroy his presidency, because Iran is not going to sit back and allow the United States to undermine it or to destroy its key assets. And it would be very difficult to destroy Iran's nuclear program anyway, because it's deep underground, like its key defense capabilities. So I would hope that sane people in Washington would push him in a different direction. But I actually believe that not only is the escalation in Ukraine intended to corner Trump, but I believe that what happened in Syria is also what the U.S. government has supported, is also intended to create escalation and to put Trump in a corner. Because remember, Tulsi Gabbard met President Assad, and after she returned to the United States, as she was a congresswoman, she met Trump. And Tucker Carlson, for example, he has very differing views on what's going on in Syria, and the same is true among a number of other people as well. So I think that I personally think that this is also not entirely. It should also, at least to a degree, be seen as an attempt to complicate the situation in the region, so that Trump is stuck with foreign policy crises and is unable to bring about the sort of change that he was speaking about at home. You know, the deep state, or the economic changes and reforms that he was speaking about. I think it is a lot of this. I think this is linked to that, just as Ukraine and the sudden intensification of military support for Ukraine. I think these are both linked.
One of the main reason, or the main reason of all of these difficulties that we're witnessing right now in that region, is because of the case of Palestine, because of what's happening right now, what has happened and what's happening, what will happen in Palestine, in Gaza, in the West Bank. Do you think that the situation in Syria would influence the policy of Arab states together with Turkey toward Palestinians?
No, the Turks, Erdogan and these Arab leaders are not going to do anything for Palestine. In fact, Netanyahu has humiliated Erdogan and Al-Qaeda in a very foolish way by destroying Syrian infrastructure, by occupying key areas in southern Syria. Netanyahu has embarrassed Erdogan. He's embarrassed Jolani, because Erdogan has to be quiet. He can't say anything. Jolani can't say anything. The country is being occupied, and he's saying, we hate Iran. They take more territory, they say, we hate Iran. So Jolani is gradually, people are going to see that. They're going to see through, they're going to see reality. Those who are stuck in their sectarianism or their, nationalism, they are gradually going to, and others, of course, who are more aware and who are more objective, everyone is going to see how Erdogan is not serious, how Jolani is not serious, and I think that Netanyahu is a fool. If I was Netanyahu, God forbid, I would not have bombed Syria. First of all, the military infrastructure in Syria is not a threat to the Israeli regime, except for those underground missile bases that were created by, I assume, Iran and Hezbollah to defend Syria with missiles against the Israeli regime. The air bases, none of those, they were all old jets. They could only use them for fighting against terrorists. Otherwise, the Israeli Air Force is much more advanced than the Syrian Air Force. But by destroying all those planes, I think what they want to do is to make sure that Syria is fragmented. That's the objective of the Israeli regime, to make sure no central government can have authority over it, because that's what Israel wants. It wants a broken Syria. It wants a broken Lebanon. It wants an impoverished and broken region so that it can rule supreme over that area and expand. However, under these circumstances, this was detrimental to the interests of the Zionist regime, because he's only embarrassing Erdogan. He's only embarrassing Jolani. And what he should have been doing is he should have just stood back and perhaps even cursed Erdogan or cursed Jolani to pretend that he's not with them. But instead he took credit for overthrowing the Syrian government, just like Biden. All of this is bad for Erdogan. All of this is bad for Al-Qaeda, because it so by bombing Syria, by taking territory, he's showing that they do not have the will to fight the Israeli regime. By taking credit for overthrowing the government of former President Assad, he's basically saying that these people are better than Assad for the Israeli regime. And gradually this is going to have an impact, even among those people who've been, as I said, who are euphoric and who are influenced by sectarian rhetoric or influenced by nationalistic rhetoric. Once the dust settles and things have calmed down, they're going to start putting the pieces together, and they're going to recognize that that this was a major conspiracy against Syria, where the Israelis are the big winners and the Palestinians are, at least in the short term, the losers. And then Erdogan is a winner, but not Turkey. But as I said earlier, I firmly believe that these people are not going to be able to control the situation. And this is going to have consequences. And the countries that are most vulnerable to these extremists, I can just say that Iran is not one of them.
Thank you so much, Professor Marandi, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Thank you very much for having me.